Humanity came from the gift. Almost mythical in its scope and scale, the gift was notable for a very high concentration of worlds that most life in the galaxy would consider ideal for settlement, and its pointed lack of sentient species to claim it. Only its distance, nearly 2,000 light-years from the spinward edge of Free Systems Alliance space, and its proximity to the Holy Union state of Atzinan, prevented rigorous colonization. By the time humanity made its first contact with the HFY, only a handful of fringe worlds closest to the FSA border had been settled, and most of those were scientific outposts rather than more traditional settler colonies. By contrast, the humans had been, shall we say, vigorous in their expansion into the gift. Of course, one couldn't blame them. Their transition out of the carbon era had been rather graceless, and by the time the 2090s had rolled around, whether or not their homeworld would remain habitable was an open question. So, when they made a quantum leap in propulsion systems and developed what they called the Alcubierre drive, humanity went in desperate search of new worlds to settle. What they found was the bounty of the gift, and that was taken advantage of with gusto. The rush, as they called it, lasted 25 years, and exported a full quarter of their population, 2.5 billion humans who relocated to a dozen or so worlds nearby to Earth. This ring of so-called rush worlds was followed by many years of more measured and planned expansion. Earth's climate was stabilized, and humanity began to look to more distant stars, now actively searching out other sentient species. 2 such species were found, but both were still decades, even centuries from reaching the stars. Instead, Earth quietly organized what they called sessions, large chunks of territory that they would leave unsettled, as the birthright of these races upon their arrival to the galactic stage. Humanity became the silent watchers in the dark for them, taking every pain to conceal their presence as they observed them develop. They even prepared to intercede to protect these young species, be it from a wayward asteroid or their own hubris. It took nearly 100 years and another revolution in their propulsion technology for the first human scout probe to arrive at Henedon, a HFY settlement on the fringes of the gift, with no more than 50,000 people on it. Days later, several manned human vessels came bearing the diplomats who would speak for their people. The discovery that most of the gift was now lost to the territory of a new sentient species sent painful ripples through the galactic economy. But humanity, and their pluralistic democratic society integrating quickly with the Free Systems Alliance, was compensation enough for the loss of so many worlds. As far as sentient species went, the humans were nothing unusual. Omnivorous, carbon and water-based, breathing the standard nitrogen-oxygen mix, with levo-amino acids, a bipedal build, and the usual 2 eyes, nose and mouth facial structure. They did tend to the tall side, but not freakishly so, and they were stronger than most. But both of those were chalked up to their native world, being on the higher end of the planetary mass spectrum. One even might be forgiven for mistaking them for a particularly tall member of the Vaskina people, who had a minimal exterior differences to these new arrivals, much to the delight of both races. Their integration to the alliance was swift, and not without hiccups. Most notably, when the human ambassador made inquiries as to the military strength of the FSA. It had to be politely explained to her that it was a rather serious diplomatic offence to ask about an ally's military strength, as it showed a deep distrust to that species. The humans seemed confused by that social convention, but nonetheless apologized profusely and didn't press the issue again. As allies went, humanity proved stalwart and committed. Their warp drives were several centuries behind the curve, but in other aspects, their ship designs from single-man fighters all the way up to carrier craft met the galactic standard. Once the necessary upgrades were furnished upon them, human ships began patrolling their portion of the Atzinan border, and whenever called, the humans answered, whether it be to a humanitarian crisis or a skirmish with one of the other hostile powers in the galaxy. 5 years after the United Nations of Earth had formally become part of the Free Systems Alliance, Ambassador Huang Dasom sat across from the HFY ambassador Kendar Nitahalemik and issued a formal invitation for Alliance members to bring a portion of their military forces to the Sol system and engage in what her translator described after a long moment of thought as Keshdak tia ve selda at im hot velariae. Now that particular word choice was rather artless, but it could be forgiven. Sindal, the principal Heshvati language, was a very contextual language, and certain words could not be used with others regardless of how well they might mesh in other languages. Still, Ambassador Nitahalemik was greatly confused by the invitation to joyfully make war without harm. When he conveyed this confusion, the translator broke linguistic protocol and simply used to the two words that the humans would use. Velaria Dahana. War games. At first he was even more confused. Surely humanity didn't view war as a game? This would have come up at some point in their cultural examinations, and had such a thing been discovered, it would have almost certain ended their chances at joining the FSA. Further explanation was required, and thankfully given. War games, in the human tradition prior to their unification, had been the highest expression of trust and friendship between nations. One country was literally inviting another's military into their territory in order to exercise with them and train on integration of tactics, systems, and manpower. It also served to foster warm relations between the lower ranks of the Allied states' armed forces. While there were very small exercises that the Alliance ran now and again, what the United Nations High Command had drawn up was enormous in scale. The humans wanted 4 weeks of exercises. The first week would focus on in-atmo flying and space engagement, taking place on and around the gas giant Saturn. The second week was to be dedicated to hostile environment deployment, this time on Saturn's moon Titan. Week 3 would take them to Ceres, where they would focus on low-gravity tactics and training, and the fourth and final week would take place on Earth itself, allowing for open-air deployment, water-based naval tactics, and urban combat simulations. An additional week after the exercises was set aside for festivities that the humans called Fleet Week, which itself was quite a concept, and mostly seemed like an excuse for members of the military of all ranks to get intoxicated and to try and sleep with as many civilians as possible. The invitation to these war games was extended to every member of the Alliance, with a stressed point to send only what they felt comfortable deploying so far from the bulk of FSA space, but also urging them to at least send observer parties from the various military commands of their allies. Organizing such an event between nearly 30 different species took quite a bit of time. But the Holy Union State had made no moves of note in some time, and the Alliance's other hostile borders were equally quiet, as the Silen Commonwealth and the Vantati Empire were presently engaged in a conflict of their own, with FSA support quietly being funneled to the Commonwealth, whom they enjoyed decent relations with and saw an opportunity for future expansion in. The Heshvati were the first to arrive in the Sol system for the first Free Systems Alliance war games, bringing with them almost all forces not slated for home defense. Waiting for them at the edge of the system was the human fleet, formerly designated the Expeditionary Forces. While making direct inquiries into the military strength of an ally was a diplomatic faux pas, one generally felt out their friend's strength over the years, and the expeditionary fleet was surprisingly on par with the rest of the FSA. 10 carriers equipped with a wing of 100 fighters each, 20 dreadnoughts capable of fielding a combined 10,000 soldiers, all escorted by 50 cruisers of 100 men each, and with a 10-ship scout flotilla. Then, of course, came another fleet of the same size, and another. 2 more, no, 5 more, no, a dozen more. Hundreds of human ships, constituting what must make up hundreds of thousands of soldiers and tens of thousands of fighters. The Heshvati generals were by equal measure confused and terrified. Demands were levelled for an explanation. Diplomatic rules be damned. What the hell was this? The humans, for their part, were equally confused. These were the fleets of the DDF and a single fleet from the expeditionary forces. They were waiting for 5 more from the EF and another dozen from the CDFs. This only prompted more confusion. DDF, CDF. What did these terms mean? And how had they hidden a military of this size from the rest of the galaxy? That's when the explanation came, and the Heshvati were chilled to their core as the humans calmly explained their full military strength. The expeditionary forces were the largest of their military forces, consisting of 10 travelling fleets. When called to action, it had been one of these 10 fleets that came to the Alliance's aid, and the FSA hadn't paid enough attention to notice that these were not, in fact, the same fleet. Aside from the travelling fleets, there were also the settlement defence flotillas, each consisting of a single carrier, 2 dreadnoughts, 10 cruisers, and 2 scout ships. Each settled system with a population below 1 million was protected by one of these flotillas. Then came the explanation of the CDFs. Commonwealth Defence Forces. These were each a standard fleet of the 10-20-50-10 configuration, and each settled system with more than 1 million people in it had one of these. There were 10 of these fleets that comprised the DDF, Domestic Defence Forces, 1 each to protect Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the far-flung planet of Terminus, with its gateway station to the Sol system, and another 5 purely to defend Earth and its moon. The HFY did the math quietly, and they were mortified. 37 human systems had populations exceeding 1 million, and then there were 154 additional systems below that. The humans, meanwhile, were just increasingly confused. They had simply believed the FSA were holding back the bulk of their forces. Hadn't that been the rule, to conceal one's true military capabilities? As the generals talked amongst themselves, they realized then that it was the gift that led to this. Humanity had been isolated, so much so that they'd had to travel thousands of light years just to find another race as advanced as them. That isolation, along with their long and complex history of warfare, had bred a people with a deep martial tradition. Even knowing nothing but peace since their unification, humanity hadn't forgotten its bloody past, and had acted according in preparing for their future. The diplomatic rule of not pressing one's allies about their strength had only reinforced this notion to them. The next question that was asked was the one no one wanted to voice. What would the humans do when they realized that they were, by an order of magnitude, the galaxy's largest military force? And what consequences would they all face if humanity were ever to be fully unleashed?